Let's start this session by revisiting the quote we began with last session. It was by Pascal, and it goes like this: "Justice without force is powerless. Force without justice is tyrannical." The artists and artworks we're looking at in this session will be going after the second half of this quote. In other words, they'll hope to address various injustices in the world by resisting tyrannical powers. This is art as activism, as making commentary on the world in the hopes of fostering change. Sometimes this can be explicit, like when the Yes Men, an art collective, published and distributed a fake edition of the New York Times in 2009, protesting the Iraq War and other U.S. policies. The newspaper presented an alternative reality where the war had ended and the U.S. economy began balancing its priorities away from outsized militarism. Of course, this didn't actually happen, and a recent report says that the U.S. has spent $8 trillion since 9/11 on the so-called War on Terror. Sometimes art as activism can be more subtle. For example, take this work by the Chinese artist Yao Lu. At first, this image looks like a beautiful landscape in the tradition of Chinese ink painting. But upon closer inspection, you'll notice that what seems like peaceful mist hanging low over the rolling green hills is actually pollution. And what look like temples are actually factories and smokestacks. And all that green isn't grass or moss, it's the color of the tarps used in China to cover huge landfills. And so all these mountains are actually mountains of trash. And finally, this isn't a painting at all, but a composite of many different photographs. The more you look at this work, the more your perception of it changes, and maybe of reality. It's a work that visually critiques pollution and the greenhouse gas emissions that are currently driving us towards climate disaster. After all, although the U.S. is historically the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, currently it's China, though largely thanks to a global economy that implicates all the so-called developed nations like the United States. One of the big questions that we have to ask ourselves is this: can art affect change in society and politics? Do artists have a say about how the world should look? Do they have any power or means to change things? Or, getting back one last time to Pascal's quote, is art just a type of justice without force? Or, maybe rather than change reality, the role of the artist is to reflect reality, in the hopes that the public and those in power start seeing reality more clearly. Another big question: what does art add to activism and resistance? If artists want to change the world, why don't they simply become activists, or journalists, or politicians, or policymakers? Is there something special and unique about art making that makes it crucial to involve in activism and public debate? An example of this might be Extinction Rebellion, a group of everyday people protesting and demanding political and economic solutions to the environmental crisis, which involves public manifestations and resistance alongside murals, posters, and other visual tactics. Whatever the case might be, these are really huge questions and difficult to resolve, but I want you to keep them in the back of your mind for this session. We're going to focus on 4 issues relating to art, activism, and resistance. First, artworks that serve political and social protest. Second, works that call attention to the history of racism. Third, works that engage with histories of colonialism. And finally, 4, works that critique sexism, misogyny, and violence towards women. Of course, all these themes have worked together in history. Political and social power, racism, colonialism, and patriarchy have often gone hand in hand. So dealing with one of these issues will simultaneously connect to the others. And this can be loosely described as intersectional thinking, when urgent issues resonate and affect one another, both in history and in the present, and when analyzing one means also analyzing the others. These are by no means the only categories related to the art of resistance, but they're important, and they've informed a number of artists, both past and present. There are currently over 500,000 homeless or unhoused people in the United States. At the same time, the richest 50 people in the country are worth as much as the poorest 165 million people. And since the 1980s, we've seen unprecedented wealth distribution upwards to the wealthiest 5% by the many trillions of dollars. It's hard not to think about all this and not want it to change somehow. An artist who was already thinking about these conditions in the 1980s was the Polish artist Krzysztof Wodiczko. The artist engineered his first homeless vehicle, which was meant to fulfill the immediate needs of unhoused people as a mobile shelter. He interviewed homeless people, asking them what they might want out of such a design, which included its expandability into a bed, an area to wash and cook, and a storage space, especially for collecting bottles and cans that are then exchanged for 5 cents each. This functional object also has a symbolic effect. It makes the condition of unhoused people more visible, rather than being relegated to a quote-unquote natural part of city life. In other words, people living out of shopping carts simply as being seen as part of the urban furniture. With its pointy metal cone, it also comes out at us like a missile or a bomb, like something we need to consider, think about, or take seriously. Wodiczko is adamant that these homeless people are not solutions in themselves. They're only temporary and pragmatic. But the hope is that their visibility will lead to the real solutions at the root causes of homelessness, which are political, economic, and social. And by social, we need to include a consideration of race, since approximately 58% of unhoused people in New York City are Black, and 31% are Latinx, and questions of mental health, since a majority of unhoused people suffer from psychological conditions. This photograph is an iconic one that shows a man moving his homeless vehicle just in front of Trump Tower. In the 1980s, Trump was already a celebrity businessman who typified the lavish lifestyle of the rich in New York City. And when he became president in 2016, he enacted a major tax cut to the wealthiest Americans, further redistributing wealth upwards and draining social programs and systems that might address the unhoused crisis, along with many other crises. In the mid-19th century, there was a movement in Europe, especially in France, that confronted head-on such social and economic inequality. This movement is called Realism. Realist artists depicted the harshness of everyday life, especially the lives of the poor and working classes of society. This was the time of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. It was also a time of political revolutions. 1830, 1848, and 1871 are all key dates associated with popular uprisings against kings and the ruling classes. In 1848, the political philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, which describes history as a struggle between the haves and the have-nots. In the 19th century, this meant the bourgeoisie on one side, those who own capital, land, and the means of production, and the working class on the other side, those who don't own anything and can only sell their bodies and time for wages, in other words, a paycheck. For Marx and Engels, when the working class becomes aware of this condition, and when they realize that economic production is actually dependent on their labor power, then they start to realize their importance in leveraging power in society. That is, if they come together as a group in solidarity. When this happens, the exploited working class becomes the proletariat. This idea is captured nicely in the following cartoon that was popular in the US at the time, which shows exactly what Marx and Engels described: the poor laboring classes holding up the five-layer cake of society under capitalism. It's important to note, Marx admired capitalism. He devoted 3 whole books to analyzing it and understood this economic system as having generated wealth unlike anything in world history. He also saw, however, how exploitive capitalism could be, how it leads to social and economic inequalities, and sought to reveal this condition. And so did many artists of the period as part of the realist movement. And here's a perfect example. This is The Gleaners by the French painter Jean-François Millet. In realist fashion, it shows a contemporary scene of labor. At first, it might seem like a beautiful scene, even idyllic, and yet it depicts difficult working conditions and labor practices. 3 women of different ages are bending over, picking up what remains of that day's harvest. You can see the big bushels of wheat in the background, and on the far right in the distance, a manager of the field on a horse. The workday seems to be done, but these 3 women are still in the field. Why is that? At first, it might seem that these are 3 workers finishing up their work. This would typify what Marx called alienated labor, which he described as being cut off from your own labor and the things that you make with it. After all, they don't go home with the wheat they just harvested, as well as suffering in the process. This too is alienated labor, for example, in painful and repetitive work. But alienated labor can also be being alienated from one's own potential as a human being. For example, mindless jobs that don't tap into the inherent intelligence of human beings, like these three women. Doesn't this capture Mia's painting rather perfectly? But that's not quite right. And the painting's title tells us as much. These three women are gleaners. Gleaners were the poorest of the poor without any job or income at all. It was common practice for owners to allow these poorest of society to enter their fields once it had been worked and allow them to pick up any remaining scraps, which the gleaners were then allowed to take home with them and bake a loaf of bread, for instance. Notice the little piles of wheat on the right side of the painting, and imagine how long it would take to assemble enough stray grains of wheat to make a meal. So Mia is depicting the lowest rung of society and their precarious existence. And by extension, he was exposing the cruelty of the economic system of capitalist ownership and the power the higher classes have over the lower ones, who either have to sell their bodies in time for wages or beg for a pittance, like these gleaners. This made the art public back then very uneasy. In fact, this painting was received with some hostility when it was first shown in the Salon of 1857. High society didn't think it was appropriate to give poor people such a prominent place in a painting. And one wonders if this hostility was generated by a sense of guilt. The critics found it off-putting and ugly. Mia does offer some hope, though. Notice the bonnets that they're wearing. What do you notice about them that's significant? If you notice that they correspond to the primary colors, blue, red, and yellow, then you have a good eye. And this may have had symbolic value. Because from these three colors, all the other colors in the spectrum can be made. This can be a metaphor for what we just talked about a moment ago and Marx's conception of the working class and the class-conscious proletariat. That just like the primary colors, workers are the foundation for the economy and the rest of society. Some years before Mia's painting, when Napoleon was the Emperor of France conquering Europe in the early 19th century, the Spanish artist Francisco Goya was the official court painter for the King of Spain. He's an interesting artist to talk about in the context of resistance, because while he was officially accepted by the powers that be, he also used his position and craft to critique existing Spanish society. He did this especially through his drawings and prints, which were an early form of visual social satire. One of his most important works is this painting, the 3rd of May, 1808, which depicts a contemporary historical event that had just happened. Napoleon and his army invaded Goya's Spain in 1808, setting off a bloody occupation. In Madrid, Spanish citizens rose up to resist the Napoleonic troops and their occupation, but the insurrection was brutally put down. The day after this failed rebellion, they were all summarily executed. Goya depicts this grisly moment in this painting, and showing this side of war was extremely rare at the time. Napoleon's troops are on the right, pointing muskets that they've just fired off. These troops are faceless automatons, all in a row, something Goya probably did on purpose so that we wouldn't identify with them as humans. He's underscoring their inhumanity. The opposite is true of the Spanish rebels on the left. They're filled with emotions, from defiance to prayer to fear. Goya is a painter of the Romanticism period, which, remember, prioritizes intense emotions. There's only one light source in the painting, that box lantern on the ground, which makes the scene even more dramatic, like film noir movies from the 1950s. Some of the rebels are already dead, laying on a bloody heap towards the left foreground. Those in the background are being led to execution, covering their faces with their hands. But of course, the focal point of the painting is the man in white. He seems to be defying the French troops, on his knees, but with arms extended out into the air as if to say, "Go ahead, kill me." It's almost like he's embracing martyrdom for his country, and many scholars have noted a connection with Christ and this crucifixion pose. To underscore this connection with the crucifixion of dying for a cause, Goya even added stigmata to the white-shirted man's palms, stigmata being scars or holes in Christ's hands that reference the nails on the cross. With this next painting, we remain in the period of Romanticism, but move over to France. And honestly, this is one of the most amazing paintings I've ever seen in person. It's in the Louvre in Paris and worth the price of admission alone. It's massive, more than 23 feet long and 16 feet high. It's the Raft of the Medusa by Theodore Géricault. Like Goya's painting that we just looked at, the Raft of the Medusa depicts a current day event, and I need to give you some backstory before analyzing the painting itself. The Medusa was a naval frigate en route from France to Senegal in Western Africa. It got shipwrecked, and there turned out not to be enough lifeboats on board for all 400 people. So the captain had a makeshift raft made from the ship's remains for those who were left over. After promising to tow the raft to safety, the captain decided to cut it loose instead. Maybe it just wasn't practical, leaving 150 people at the mercy of the sea. He probably hoped no one would survive to tell the tale, but that's not how things turned out. After drifting for 13 terrible days, they were found, though only 15 people survived. This is a horrible story of sickness, cannibalism, and death. It's also a story of political scandal and corruption. The captain of the ship, appointed only because he was an aristocrat aligned with the French monarchy, turned out to be completely incompetent and foolishly sailed too close to shore. When the story broke out in the press, the anti-royalists, those in France who opposed the monarchy, were incensed. The Medusa and its raft became a symbol of King Louis XVIII's incompetent and rallying cry against monarchic conservative values. So, only a few years later, Géricault decided to use this scandalous event as the subject matter for his major painting. He even built a life-size model of the raft in his studio with actors in poses. And he didn't stop there. He also went to the morgue to study cadavers and to the hospital to study amputated limbs. The composition is a fascinating one. In one way, it's a triangular composition, but in another, it's a diagonal composition, leading your eye from the bottom left to the top right. And there's this ripple of emotion that changes as you go from the bottom left to the top right. Dead bodies and a father grieving his son give way to figures very much alive and animated at the top of the raft. This mix of emotions is echoed by the sea itself. You have a big ominous wave coming at the raft from the left and turbulent foam just in front of it. That lifeless and seemingly headless body hanging off the raft on the bottom is especially evocative. But then you also have the sun starting to peek out through the horizon, just behind the makeshift mast of the raft and behind the oncoming wave. What Géricault's done is brilliant because both these design elements, the up and down emotions of the figures and the duality of the ocean and sky, fit perfectly with the moment in the story he chose to depict, namely, the first glimmering hope of being saved. It's hard to make out, but just at the right of the figure, with reddish shorts waving his white shirt, you can see a speck on the horizon of the ocean. This is a ship way off in the distance. Will it get bigger and come closer, or will the raft drift away and cruelly miss being saved by a hair? In the end, we know the ship does spot the raft, saving those on board. This work is critical of the monarchy and corruption, and in this way it resists the power structures of Géricault's day. But there's one more key detail in this painting that points to a different form, but related form of resistance. Note the figure at the very top, waving a red and white torn fabric. His name was Jean-Charles, and he was a black soldier aboard the Medusa who was part of those left for dead but then saved. Géricault has given him pride of place in this composition, and this wasn't a coincidence. Géricault deplored the slave trade and was an abolitionist. An abolitionist is someone who wants to end the practice of slavery. After being abolished in 1794 in France, slavery was reenacted in the French colonies in 1802. So, by giving a black body prominent place in his painting critical of monarchy, Géricault was also making a statement about the slave trade and the racial discrimination inherent in this unethical practice. And pointing to Jericho's abolitionism, as encoded in the Raft of the Medusa, gives us a nice transition to the next painting and our focus on race. Henry Osawa Tanner was raised during the Civil War by parents who were abolitionists. His mother was a former slave, and his father was a minister. Tanner studied in Philadelphia with the American realist painter Thomas Eakins, who we'll meet again in a subsequent session. After struggling to make ends meet in the U.S., Tanner moved to Paris and became a well-known painter of genre scenes. Here's a great example that shows a humble room where a child learns how to play the banjo from an older man. The painting style is a cross between realism and impressionism. So, on the one hand, you get an image that brings dignity to poor living condition, a staple of realist painting, while on the other you see experimentation with the effects of light and color, a staple of impressionist painting. There's this beautiful play between complementary colors, a blue light and a warmer yellow-orange light, which are reflected on the instrument, the clothes, and the faces of the two figures, along with the tablecloth plates and wall in the background. Tanner has painted this scene with looser brushstrokes. At times you can even see and feel them. They're palpable. This is also another staple of the Impressionist style. Above all, Tanner was interested in debunking damaging stereotypes about blackness. He not only painted but also wrote about such stereotypes. This was a time when racist depictions were a major part of visual culture and entertainment. For example, actors performing in blackface and minstrel shows that often featured the banjo. If today this instrument is most often associated with Southern music like country and bluegrass, it was in fact invented by 17th century slaves in the Caribbean, and its lineage can be traced back to African roots, like the kora, a similar-looking stringed instrument. This is one of the innumerable contributions Afro-descendant peoples have made to American culture. Just think of blues, jazz, and hip-hop. By placing the banjo in the hands and everyday context of two human beings whose individuality and humanity are apparent, Tanner undercuts racist stereotypes, which are always gross generalizations about certain people. He would become a major influence on the Harlem Renaissance in the 1930s and 1940s, like Aaron Douglas, who we studied during our first session. Of course, racial discrimination remains no less an issue today, and there have been a spike of hate crimes against Asian Americans during the pandemic. Here's another artist actively resisting it, Roger Shimomura. He's a Japanese-American U.S. citizen from Seattle, but in 1942, he and his family were placed in an internment camp. This was a reaction to Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entering World War II, and on the executive order of FDR, around 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were forcibly relocated to concentration camps around the interior West Coast. Shimomura has described the living conditions as horrible. He'd go on to be a painter to combat racism, though in a different way from Tanner. He's best known for placing his own face on the faces of famous people in history. Probably his most well-known painting is Shimomura crossing the Delaware, where he substitutes his face onto George Washington's. He'll also often use stereotypical imagery from advertising and cartoons of people from Asian descent. As a pop artist, he includes these images directly in his works, and viewers are often forced to confront them. In this painting, called Diary, Minidoka Series number 3, deals with the history of Japanese internment camps. In the foreground is the artist's grandmother, writing in her diary. She documented the family's experience at one of these camps in Idaho. He's in the background with his mother in what appears to be a traditional Japanese home. Look closer, though, and you'll see a barbed wire fence appearing just beyond the stylized mist, in direct reference to the camps. So Shimomura is invoking traditional Japanese print styles. You've already seen a couple ukiyo-e prints in this class, and he's definitely referencing those, but updates it for a contemporary political event and injustice. With this work, we move to the topic of colonialism. It's by the contemporary Congolese artist Aimé Mpane, who lives and works in Brussels, Belgium, and Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. His practice is deeply connected to his native Congo and its colonial history. In this installation, this is his installation, Congo Shadow of a Shadow, from 2005. And in installation, is an artwork that you can walk into and which will often have multimedia components. There's a figure standing in the middle of the room contemplating a grave marker. The figure has been sculpted out of wooden matches that have had their heads, the part of the match used to strike a flame, removed. You can make out the human shape quite clearly, but you can also see through this figure. Presumably male, he's backlit by a strong light, which creates a shadow on the wall. Both the figure made of matches and his silhouette are really ghostly. On the grave marker is written, quote, Congo, 1885. This is in reference to the Berlin Conference, where the European powers defined and divvied up their power and territory over the African continent. The Congo went to Belgium's King Leopold II, who was a brutal colonialist ruler. So you get the sense that the grave mourns the Congo, that this area in Africa died when it was colonized. You now also get the sense that the matchstick man is actually a personification of the Congo. On the floor, Mpane has also included 3 flat wooden silhouettes of a man, a woman, and a child, as if they were fallen bodies on the ground, again likely in reference to violence and colonial domination. That the central figure is made of matchsticks is far more significant than might first appear. Mpane is making several connections here at once. When tobacco, a plant indigenous to Northern America and used for ritual and medicinal purposes, became a leisurely activity to wealthy Europeans smoking for pleasure, there was a need for easy lighting. This led to the industrialization of matchstick production in Europe, which often employed women and young children in terrible factory conditions. So the artist is making a connection between the colonization of indigenous peoples in North America and the exploitation of the working classes in Europe. But the connections don't stop there, because the slaves forced to tend the tobacco fields and plantations in the United States were forcibly removed from Africa, including the Congo. So, in fact, Mpane is making a connection between 3 sites of exploitation and dominance in this installation: Europe, the so-called New World, and the African continent. As a form of quiet resistance, this is a powerful installation that calls attention to these complex histories of colonialism. Another celebrated artist working with inventive materials as quiet resistance is the Ghanaian sculptor El Anatsui. Today he's based in Nigeria, but he grew up in Ghana during the post-colonial presidency of Kwame Nkrumah, one of the great leaders of the independence movements in Africa in the 20th century. Nkrumah coined the term neocolonialism, which describes the ways former colonies remain under foreign rule, not through direct military force, but through political and economic coercion. One day in 1998, Anatsui found a bag of bottle caps on the side of the road. And this was an accident, but a major artistic discovery for him. They became his ideal material, which he described as even more versatile than paint. This work, titled fittingly, Versatility, is made up entirely of liquor bottle caps that have been flattened and woven together with copper wire, creating a mosaic of textures and colors. Is it a painting, a sculpture, something else entirely? Whatever the case might be, the final works that he makes are always movable. They flow into nearly endless shapes. Anatsui considers his works to be like living organisms, and he doesn't dictate their shape or how they should be displayed. He leaves this up to the collectors and curators who show his work, which means that no work is ever shown the same way twice. While Anatsui's work has become incredibly popular on the global art market, fetching huge prices, he continues to live a modest life. And most importantly, he makes a point of being socially engaged. When he has major commissions, he'll hire local students, teachers, and other people to work in his studio, often for pay that's much more than their yearly salaries. As his studio manager says, Anatsui, quote-unquote, extends his workshop into the community. He also buys his raw materials, bottle caps, from nearby businesses, further helping the economy around him. In this way, the process and making of his works are a form of resistance, a resistance against the global economy that often extracts value from African countries without much thought about the resulting political and social conditions. We now turn to another incredibly urgent issue, namely the role of women in art and history. To do so, we turn to feminist practices that have advocated for ending discrimination based on sex and gender. Until recently, it's been rare for women to be artists, and more generally in positions of power of any kind. Especially in Western art history, artistic genius has often been synonymous with male genius. Women have far more often appeared in paintings than being painters themselves. The reasons for this are many, but in some, this situation points to patriarchal bias in much of human history, that men do the leading and women do the following, that men are active and women passive, that men do the inventing and women the nurturing. In the Baroque period, around the early 17th century, there lived a groundbreaking female artist. She is usually one of the first women artists that students meet in their chronological art history textbooks, and her name was Artemisia Gentileschi. She was taught by her father and very quickly exceeded him in talent and ability. Her father was a follower of Caravaggio, one of the great Italian Baroque painters known for a gritty style that uses stark contrast between light and dark for dramatic effect in biblical scenes. This play between light and dark in art is called chiaroscuro, which uses the modulation between light and dark to create volume and three-dimensionality. Caravaggio used it so heavily that art historians had to come up with a new term, tenebrism, which creates such stark contrast and darkness that it's really the pronounced feature in his works. I think you can tell from Judith and her maidservant with the head of Holofernes that Gentileschi also used tenebrism to great effect. There's only one stark light source, a candle, which lights up the skin and the clothes of the two figures with this luminous golden light. The resulting colors are incredible. Look at how deep and saturated the yellow, violet, and red fabrics are in this painting. Nearly everything else is cast in darkness, which not only makes the figures pop out visually, but you also get the sense that their space is jutting into your space as the viewer, and you'll remember that this is a key attribute of Baroque art. The iconography here is biblical. Gentileschi is referencing the story of Judith, who saved her people from the king Holofernes by entering into his living quarters to entice him, but ultimately killing him by cutting off his head. Gentileschi made numerous versions of this story. In this one, the killing is done, and her maidservant is stuffing the dead king's head into a sack at the bottom of the painting. It's a grisly scene, and there's this palpable sense of suspense in the image. Judith and her servant are staying as quiet as possible so as not to alert the guards who are likely posted just outside the king's chambers. Gentileschi herself was likely sexually violated by a colleague of her father's. She even gave testimony against this person at trial. Scholars debate how this experience affected her painting practice, but it's safe to say that it must have. Some argue that focusing on the story of Judith, who is a key proto-feminist figure, was a way of getting revenge. But simply becoming a great painter in the history of art at a time when it was almost completely dominated by men is already in some sense a form of vindication. Here we have a photomontage by the Dada artist Hannah Hock. Photomontage was a relatively new medium of using images from advertisements and magazines as a collage. Collage comes from the French word coller, to glue, which uses cut-out colored paper or newspaper affixed to a surface to form shapes and images. So a photomontage is effectively a photo collage. This work was made at the beginning of the Weimar period in Germany, just after World War I. The Dadaists were a group of international artists who were virulently opposed to war and the elite social classes they deemed to be responsible for its destructiveness. Here, Hock makes fun of several politicians in this work called Cut with the Dada Kitchen Knife through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epoch in Germany, including Kaiser Wilhelm, who was largely responsible for getting Germany into the war. Even this long title is a joke, is mocking, and maybe a bit feminist too, in the sense that a kitchen knife, often associated with feminine domestic work, is cutting into the corrupt beer belly of the Weimar Republic that Hock found herself in. This was also a time of the new woman, when women entered the post-war workforce like never before and took up new modern styles and fashions, notably short haircuts. A deeper analysis of this photomontage would reveal that Hock has depicted women as the new engines of society. All the gears, wheels, and machinery in this image are being made to move by famous women, including Hock herself, who looks out at you at the bottom right wearing pants and sporting a mod new woman haircut. Just below her is one more important detail to point out. Do you see that map of Europe? Some of the countries are shaded in black, while others are in white. This map shows where women had the right to suffrage, of being allowed to vote in elections, and where they did not. For example, France is in black, and amazingly enough, French women only got to vote in 1944, only 77 years ago. So not only is Hawke ridiculing current-day politicians, who were corrupt during the Weimar Republic, but she's also advocating for universal women's suffrage. This photo montage, then, is a double act of social resistance. Much more recently, in 1985, a group of women artists got together and formed the Guerrilla Girls, an activist collective who still today goes around protesting various injustices that they see, especially in the art world and its institutions. They wear gorilla masks, not only as a play on words, gorilla and gorilla, but also to remain anonymous so that the issues that they raise stay front and center. They'll often show up uninvited to display posters, slogans, and to appear physically in protest. Here they are at the Venice Biennale, one of the premier exhibitions of contemporary art in the world that happens every 2 years, protesting the lack of representation of both women and artists from African countries. In this image, we see their guerrilla projection on the outside of the new Whitney Museum in New York from 2015. The projection is making a scathing comment on the employee pay in the museum, sarcastically pointing out how expensive art can be, and therefore how tough it must be for billionaire trustees to actually pay museum employees a fair and living wage. Of course, the tone is completely facetious. Here's another example. A public service announcement from the Guerrilla Girls called The Advantages of Being a Woman Artist from 1988. I really recommend pausing the lecture for a moment and reading the whole thing. Then analyze the messages. What are they advocating for? And how are they advocating for it? In other words, what's the tone here? In our final work for this session, we take a look at a much more somber installation. This is Patricia Cronin's Shrine for Girls, which appeared at the Venice Biennale in 2015. It was installed in a 16th century church in Venice. Upon entering, the viewer found 3 heaps of fabrics on 3 different altars, each one under a spotlight. The central altar was a colorful collection of saris, a garment commonly worn by women from South Asia. Upon closer inspection, you could see a small photograph of 2 teenage girls. These 2 girls had just been raped, murdered, and hung by a tree. This is a harrowing and sad story, and the other 2 altars convey similar stories. One references the killing of girls by the Boko Haram in Nigeria, while the other references the forced labor and exploitation of young women by a Roman Catholic order named the Magdalene Laundries. In sum, this is a devastating and solemn installation that mourns the loss and devaluation of girls and women from around the world. The statistics are staggering and depressing. 1 out of 3 women experience some form of physical, often sexual violence in their lifetimes, most often at the hands of someone close to them, like a domestic partner. This has gotten even worse over the past 1.5 years during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's safe to say that there's a pandemic of misogyny and violence towards women, which the World Health Organization urges everyone to see as a healthcare crisis and violation of human rights. Crucially, Cronin has made connections between her work and organizations that fight and resist violence against women. You can even visit the website associated with this work to get informed and even get involved. And here it is, shrineforgirls.org. In our next session, we're going to discuss the theme of the human body in art history. And while many other sub-themes will come to the surface, one of the main ones will be the question of the female body and the visual and other forms of control that art has imposed on the female form. There are many important artists resisting these forms of control and domination today, and I hope this session on resistance introduced you to a few of them.